Season 3, Episode 2, Idahosa Ness, Pronunciation Mastery.
This is the Actual Fluency Podcast, helping you become a better language learner by providing motivating weekly inspiration, as well as top tips and tricks from expert guests. And now, your host, Chris Broholm.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Actual Fluency Podcast. This is the second episode of the third season, and I'm so happy that so many of you decided to join me on the premiere of the third season, where I was talking to Heike Yamamoto. If you haven't listened to that episode already, I suggest you go back and listen to it, as I had a blast doing that one. And a lot of people have watched it or listened to it, as the podcast is now available on YouTube and on the usual audio route. So iTunes, you can go on the website, afpodcast.com. You can go on Stitcher. I mean, it's everywhere. If there's a podcast aggregation service, it's the Actual Fluency Podcast will be on there. So I'm really happy that so many of you guys tuned in again, and I'm sorry for the delay once again, but now we're back and in full swing, and I've already recorded a few interesting interviews, and I've already listed a long list of amazing guests for this season, so I'm looking forward to that. But before that, I just want to introduce today's guest, which is Idahosa Ness from Mimic Method. And he joins us now. And Idahosa, why don't you give the listeners a little introduction as to how you got started in language learning?
Well, the first language I learned was Spanish. I went to Mexico when I was 16 did some kind of university program with my dad's a university professor, so I got to go for free. And and while I was there, I had high school Spanish, but was just as not serious about it as anybody else. And then I got there, got really into, Mexican culture. I really that was my first time traveling on my own, really. And then I learned Spanish kind of quicker than people around me. And then that was the first time I kind of learned the language and got really into it. I went back to Mexico when I was 17. I spoke Spanish by the time I graduated high school. And when I got to university, I decided, well, since I'm already kind of good at Spanish, I might as well do a new language. So I decided on Mandarin Chinese, and then now I speak Mandarin, Spanish, Portuguese, French, and German.
Cool. And was that a university offering the Mandarin, or was that just
it's one of those intense Mandarin courses you go almost every day. And then I went to I studied abroad in Shanghai and Beijing in total for almost a year. And same kind of story there. I was able to pick up the language faster than my peers, and it was at that time I started to kind of formulate a philosophy around why that was, what I was doing differently. One of the core things I noticed at the very beginning with Spanish is that if you actually make the effort to try to sound like the people, not only do people kind of relate to you a bit more when you do the accent better, but the actual acquisition of the language became faster because you're able to kind of connect and hear the words easier and stuff. So that's what happened. Then when I got the Chinese, the whole idea of accent and pronunciation became even more clear, since it's a tonal language. And I invested a lot of energy and time at the very beginning getting the tones correct, whereas my classmates either didn't care that much or didn't quite get it at first. And then that once again carried over, and I was able to learn Mandarin much faster as a result. And then, and then soon after that, after I graduated, I went to Brazil and then learned Portuguese on my own, just kind of in the streets, and applied my own kind of philosophy again. And that it was in Brazil that I came up with my own concrete philosophy about how one should go about learning a language.
Cool. And we'll get into the whole pronunciation question in a minute, because I know that's
Sure.
a controversial topic, or maybe not controversial, that's probably taking it too far, but people at least have very split opinions on it. Learn to say it right or die. Yeah. But first, I just wanted to talk about I would say the famous video on the internet called Skype Me Maybe, which is where I first saw you. Can you describe, the process of being part of that, and has that done anything for you in terms of people getting to know you or reaching out?
Yeah, sure. I mean, one thing it does is I still get a steady traffic of Skype requests. But yeah, it was pretty straightforward. Benny, it was organized by Benny Lewis from Fluent in 3 Months, and he's got his stuff together pretty good. So he had like a whole process. He emailed me and it was like, if you choose a language, these are the ones available. And I was like, I'll do this and this. Come back with a lyric. I have a musical background, so it wasn't really hard for me to just come up. I was actually in Brazil again at the time, and I was actually at my office at like late at night. I was like, all right, fine, and then just recorded it really quick, sent it in. A couple weeks later, we had this epic video. I was like, man, that was really well done.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and as far as my input into it, it wasn't that much. But Benny and whoever his team was did all the work.
Right. Yeah, it's a great video, and it's I love it. I mean, I'm still listening to it like after 50 times or something.
Yeah.
So good. I mean, maybe one criticism is there's a little bit too much Benny at some points, but I guess he couldn't find enough people who were
Right,
actually.
he did all the work, so he deserves all the.
Oh yeah,
extra
for
credit.
sure. I mean, huge credit to him for uniting that many people in one video. So that's
Sure.
good fun, and I guess in a way it's sort of it's a good advertisement for multilingualism in general. So
Yeah.
that's pretty cool. So getting into the learning process. Well, let's just jump into pronunciation, because that's obviously your main focus, and something that I personally didn't think was that important until very recently. Because when you start learning a language, my first logical instinct was, well, why do I need a better than good enough pronunciation? And maybe you'd like to answer that question, because in my mind I would be like, okay, as long as I could be understood, then that would be okay. But I mean, recently I changed my mind. But maybe you want to answer that question first. Why is it important to really focus on the pronunciation, and why not just stop at good enough? You sound like a foreigner, but it's okay.
Sure. I mean, there's a couple of things there. First is really basic. Understanding what pronunciation is. Pronunciation is so if you say one thing and the native speaker says the same word but differently, what's going on is you're making different sounds, right? So pronunciation is about what sounds do you make. And if you take a step backwards and think, what we're doing right now? What is language communication? We're just making a bunch of sounds with our mouths, smacking our lips and tongues together, and then hearing them with our ears, right?
It's
So
true,
at the physical core, what we're doing is pronunciation. And if the word was apple, but I pronounced it apple, then you might not understand me, right?
Right.
And like maybe if you're used to a whole culture of people saying apple, you can adjust your ear, and now you have a wider interpretation of that word or that concept. But in general, the core of it is I'm making sounds, you're making sounds. If we don't agree on what those sounds are, then the whole goal of what we're doing of language learning is lost. So that's where I start, where it's pronunciation it's not so much about perfecting your accent, though that's kind of the ideal. It's about getting the core sounds. And the reason why I found that affects the way that someone learns, or the speed or the degree to which someone learns a language, is because if you've had the problem of knowing how to read a bunch of words, but when you hear someone speaking very fast and you can't understand them or recognize those words, that's fundamentally a problem of pronunciation, because once again, he's hearing those words differently than you are. Secondly, if you're kind of doing all these kind of grammar calculations in your head, and you're kind of doing this kind of Frankenstein approach to learning it, instead of having it naturally flow out of you the way it does in your first language, once again, it's because the core foundation of the sound might not be in order. So that's what we start for. That's what I strive for. It's not so much, though I like to strive for it being able to be like indiscernible in my accent. That's really hard to achieve. But if you get to when you say, "What is that good enough?" There certainly is a good enough where you can lock into every sound, get it like 90% of the way there, and you can actually achieve that very quickly if you do the right approach. And I think the reason why most people don't take pronunciation seriously at first is because it seems too kind of convoluted of a subject and too difficult to get into. So that was my goal when I started my company, was how do I make this more accessible to people? But then, yeah, once you're at that good enough, and you hear someone with a slight accent in language, but they can really connect with it, then you know, that's fine. I'm not like an accent Nazi, and I'm like, you don't sound exactly like an American. Because at the end of the day, even me as an American, I'm one of 1,000 different accents of English, right? So who's to say that mine is better than anyone else's, or why yours should be the same? But you know, you have a different pronunciation than me, but I understand you 100%. You can, if I said a new word, you'd be able to pick it up very easily because you can lock in and you don't have to see it written down. But but yeah, you know, and like you have your own shade of accent, and that's good. I don't need you to sound just like me, you know?
Right, and it's an interesting point because I mean, if you go to something like the north of England, then people have accents there that are. I mean, if an American went there and had never been exposed to that accent before, it might actually be impossible to understand what the person was saying. You know,
For
the
sure.
Scouse accent, or you know, the Northern England is really hard. I mean, even for me, who's been pretty exposed to that accent over the years, sometimes I'm like, what did he just say? You know, so that's a funny or probably important fact to consider when you're learning an accent of a foreign language, where that's probably also the case. If you go to Italy, you know, there are tons of different accents all around the country. So even the idea of a correct accent seems a little bit like a
Yeah,
fairy tale in a way.
and you bring up a good point. So when I think about language, like I always tell people, don't learn a language, like learn a people, right? And like, because I mean, I can learn I can learn the English language and like read books on it and be a scholar of the English language, or but I mean, or a better example would be Portuguese, right? I can be a scholar of the Portuguese language, but why am I doing it? Why am I taking away time from other activities I could be doing to do this? It's because I want to talk to people from Portugal or from Brazil. Like at the end of the day, that's what we're all here for, right? Just to talk
Right.
to people. And for English, that's the thing, we get so caught up in these names, like this is the English language. But you know, what people are speaking in Northern England is called the same thing that I speak, but I can't understand them. Therefore, like, what's the point? I can go up there and be like, no, you're not speaking proper, and like, oh, get out of here, mate. But if I went there and I focus on learning the people of Northern England and then trying to mimic their pronunciation, then they'll bring me in like, oh, he's one of us, and then like, you know, and then I can come in there and you know, and then once again fulfill my ultimate goal, which is to make more friends, connect with people deeper through these random sounds we're making by smacking our lips together.
Right. And it would be quite boring if we all had the same standard American English
Of
accent.
course,
Because then, I mean, when you went to other places, they'd be like, that you'd miss that kind of novelty effect
yeah,
of
flavor.
I mean, I love accents in
Yeah,
languages because it shows you that they're from somewhere, you know, mysterious in a way until you learn where they're from. In Denmark, you know, we have a tiny country, 5, 6 million people, and there are so different accents that people have trouble understanding each other on such a small
sure.
landmass. So that's really amazing when you meet people like that. You're like, wow, it's like you truly are from a different part of even this small country. And then if you meet someone out in the world speaking with a, let's say, different English accent, you're like, oh, that's interesting. You know, that's really cool. Where are you from? And you know, that would be lost if we all spoke the same accent. So that would be kind of
For
boring.
sure. I mean, that hits close to home for me because I grew up in the U.S. and would be considered having a standard kind of a general American accent, as they call it. But my mom is from Nigeria, which is ex-British colony. So everyone educated there speaks English, but they have a like a Nigerian accent, and they even have another way of speaking called Pidgin English. And you know, I thought like this. I'm not gonna talk to you about these things, and then and that kind of thing. And like, so growing up, my mom and my uncles and my friends' parents, and I grew up around that, and I actually like love hearing that English. Like whenever I hear it, it's like it just makes me happy. And so I always get kind of defensive whenever someone's like, "Oh, that's not proper English," or when anyone kind of gets really, you know, bougie about accents and stuff. It's like, man, at the end of the day, you're telling me that we need to get rid of this. That's like the funnest thing of my life. At the end of the
Right.
day, it's all about fun. So stop being so rigid and uptight. It's about having fun, and that's what pronunciation is for me. Is like, you know, if I'm in a room full of Nigerians and they're having this conversation, I want to connect with them. I want to join in, and that means I got to sound like them. You know, so it's the same experience when I'm in Brazil or in Germany or whatever. You just got to sound like people, and you can connect with them more.
Right. And how did you come up with the technical aspects of the mimic method? Because one thing is have the idea that pronunciation is important, but how do you translate that into something that you can actually give to people and say, here, use this and you'll be better, or you'll improve this? Or how do you go through that process?
Sure. So like I said, I think the reason why a lot of people are like, oh, you don't have to worry about pronunciation, is because they don't have a solution and they don't want to discourage people and be like, oh, well, it's impossible. If you're not already good at it, it's impossible. And so that's something I thought about for a while. I had a knack for it from an early age. And then when I got to Brazil, I started learning Brazilian music, particularly like different instruments, percussive instruments. And what happened was I played violin my whole life. I played other instruments, and I generally consider myself like decent at music. But when I got to these Brazilian different contexts, my ear couldn't process some of the nuances, some of the details of the rhythms, and it was super frustrating to me. I was like, oh, why can't I get this? And so one day I just sat down and I just grinded out, and I just analyzed every single aspect of all these percussion beats I was doing in this group I was part of. And then through that process, I came up with like a technique for myself to learn these rhythms. And then I was able to learn like very quickly once I got super analytical about it. And then, so I did that. I played with this drum band and we did like shows and stuff. And then one day I was just kind of like coming home from a practice on the bus, kind of jump something out. And I just had this kind of epiphany, like, oh my God, I can apply that exact same technique to learning how to pronounce phrases, because at the end of the day, the same way I'm hitting this drum with a stick is the same way I'm hitting like the top of my mouth and my tongue. It's just about coordination and coordinating it with sound. So I went home and like basically adapted that same kind of method I did for the percussion to like a Portuguese song and to an English song. And I kind of rushed out into the street and started grabbing random Brazilians and random foreigners and like started testing it out on them. I was testing out this technique, and it worked. And basically within like a few minutes, I was able to like, teach Brazilians with no English experience how to pronounce a phrase with like a near perfect English accent. And then likewise, random foreigners to like say these Portuguese sounds and these Portuguese phrases with a near perfect accent. And so, yeah, I realized that you can control the variables and break it down. And then soon after that, I figured out a way to kind of put the experience online. And then, and that's how I went from there.
The rest is history.
That's history.
And speaking of music, apart from being used in your method as well, that is a great tool to improve pronunciation, isn't it? In practical terms, and at least that's what everyone seems to be saying. But can you maybe explain why it is that music is so helpful in pronunciation?
Sure. It's basically two reasons. And this has been researched. When you put if I say something to you like, hey, what time do you want to do this Skype interview? Right? There's a certain rhythm to that, but it's not being emphasized in normal speech. But if I put like a beat to it, I'm like, hey, when do you want to go do this interview? Then what happens is the structure of the musical beat kind of puts things more clearly in your perception of sounds. So that's something they've said. Secondly, and most importantly, pronunciation is a physical skill. It's a motor movement. If you imagine trying to learn like salsa for the first time, or trying to learn how to, ride a bike or something, you don't do it right the first time, right? You can only do it through lots of repetition of the right movement. And in most scenarios, repeating something over and over again is super boring. But music is by definition repetition. And it's the only context for us humans where repetition is not just not boring, but like extremely fun and engaging. So if I wanted to just pronounce that phrase, when's our Skype interview? And I just said, say this over and over again, you'd fall asleep. But if I put like some dubstep music to it and then a light on a beat, like, oh, when's the right energy tonight? And then you can do it like 1,000 times and never get bored. And then the muscles in your tongue, lips, and throat are going to strengthen and then get that muscle memory needed to speak those sounds in normal conversation without thinking about it.
Right. And a bit of a technical question. You speak Mandarin Chinese, and is it true that when they sing in Mandarin, the tones are not as in the spoken, or are there tones in singing Mandarin? And if so, how does Mandarin songs help you to get a better grasp of the tones?
Yeah, it's a good question. For whenever we do musical things, so what we started doing recently with our courses is we use music and songs, but we also songify normal phrases, so they can actually take a beat and like the way they do on those YouTube videos and like put it to a beat for you. We do that a lot for Mandarin because you're correct. Mandarin is a tonal language, which means the actual pitch of your voice influences the meaning, and it's important for you to get really nuanced pitch hearing. So if I put a phrase to a melody, then the pitches by definition become distorted. So when we use songs, we almost always use rap, and then only the type of rap songs where the artist is staying more or less true to the tonal pronunciation. But yeah, it's correct. You won't learn tones from learning Mandarin melodic songs.
Right. Yeah, I imagine that would be a hard thing to do,
Sure.
if not impossible. One thing about pronunciation that I found interesting was the Michael, the guy behind Hyperpolyglot. No, not Hyperpolyglot. Hyperglot, the movie. In Berlin, during a talk, he said something about how actors learn how to use diction and really control their voice. And he said one of the really good things about when you're in a beginner stage would be to exaggerate the pronunciation of the native speaker. So you mimic them, but in a sort of exaggerated way. And as you start to get better at it, you of course tone it down, but you can't really underperform it and then tone it up. I don't know what you think about something like exaggeration. If that's
for sure, that's core to a lot of our techniques. So I always tell people you want to start off exaggerated and always. And once again, you just always. I think people need to stop thinking about language as like this separate category of things. Like I said, you're just smacking your jaw and lips together. It's a physical movement. And once again, if anyone who's ever learned like a new physical skill in adulthood, a dance, a martial art, you notice that when you first learn it, you exaggerate all the parts of the movement, and then after a while, you start to tone it down, as you said, where you figure out what the core kind of movements are and how to do it with the minimal amount of energy. So if I'm speaking like English, and I'm trying to learn an sound, I'd be like car, and then and I do that enough times so my muscles and my tongue get comfortable. Eventually I can say car, and then I can do just the minimal amount needed for the person to hear the R sound and then move on. So, but yeah, you can't do the opposite way. You can't do bad and then tone it up. It has to be over, hyper clock it, as they call it, and then kind of gracefully fall back down.
Right, because I think when I started learning Russian, I was a little bit, maybe timid is the right word. I was a little bit nervous to just really over exaggerate the Russian pronunciation, and some of them are really unique and different from what I'm used to. But I imagine if I had to learn it again, and if I start out exaggerating instead, I probably would have a better pronunciation today, because like you say, you can always tone it down. But for me now, to relearn it is really difficult. I guess relearning anything is really difficult. So.
Yeah, and you brought up a point too I wanted to address, which was you said you felt strange, kind of exaggerating the sounds, and I tell people about that. Like, so when I said I was 16, I learned Spanish. That's when I first realized that exaggerating pronunciation or really trying to sound like the native has a difference, because your classmates are all kind of like not really engaged, like yo quiero más tacos, and you're like no yo quiero más tacos, and so they wouldn't care, and then as a result, they never really got into it. And I thought about that a while, like, why is it such a big deal for someone to just say "yo quiero más tacos" and then drop their American way of speaking or whatever their native thing is? And I realized, if you think about it, after your appearance, the way you sound is the number one way people judge instantly who you are, and be like, oh, he sounds like he's uneducated, or he sounds like he's manly or not manly, all that kind of stuff. So we have a certain identity we associate to the way we sound, and then we build that up our whole lives, and then we're adults, and then we want to learn a new language, and then all of a sudden we have to sound like a Chinese person. Like we have to just all of a sudden imagine ourselves as a Chinese person, and a lot of people are like really resistant to do that. So instead of being like, "你好," they'll be like, 你好, whoa, sure, make well ren. And the thing is, you have two things. You have to realize that like you might feel like you sound stupid to your classmates, but to the 1 billion Chinese people, if you sound that way, you just sound normal. And whatever your normal is different from other people's normal. Like I was teaching someone the other day in Portuguese, they have a sound and they say there's the Museum of Modern of Arte there, and that would be and to an American, that sounds like like someone with mental issues. And they're like, meh. but like to them, it's just a normal sound. And
Yeah.
people giggle when you do it, but it's like, man, to them, it's just like, why are you laughing? This is the name of our museum. So everyone has their own thing. You just got to people laugh at English sounds all the time, like the TH and the R. They think it's stupid, but it's normal to us.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why I mean, this is just a subset of learning a language, but it's such a wonderful one. And
Yeah.
one thing I wanted to get a little back to is one of the first things you said was that improving your pronunciation, or I guess focusing on it and not just like not caring, like you say most people do, focusing on it brings a lot of benefits. And one of them you said was that you actually start to understand more as well, which I think was an interesting point, because I think a lot of people assume pronunciation to be based purely on your output and it doesn't really change your input. But can you talk a little bit about how you developing your own pronunciation helps you to identify others as well?
Sure. I mean, so it's two sides of the same sword of sound, which is pronunciation and perception. So once again, you might know a word on paper, but you're not able to recognize it in a fast conversation because there's a skill of being able to recognize it in all the different nuances of, for example, in English, we drop a lot of sounds and words. So to you, you might think of the words, I got to do this, but then someone's in the street and they're like, hey, I got to do this, and it's completely different pronunciation. So that's one aspect where like, how do you lock in on that? Secondly, speech is really fast. Like human speech is super fast. And the only way we can understand each other is if our brains are able to process it super fast. And when you go to a new language, they have a whole different patterns of sounds. So the process of sitting down and like, slowing, that's what we do. We slow things down for you. And then you listen to each one, try to fix your mouth around it. The process of really engaging it in the pronunciation at the same time trains your ear. So when you speed it back up again, you can hear it without thinking. So that's basically the relationship between the two. You pronounce things based on how you hear them. And like back to Chinese tones, for example, they actually done studies. A person who has no Chinese background will actually not hear the sounds. They can kind of measure what you're hearing, your auditory cortex. They can measure that, and they can see that if you're like an American with no Chinese background, you will not hear the tones. And if you can't hear the tones, how can you actually pronounce the tones? So, but if you train it, just like anything else, you can train your ear and then be, just as good as a Chinese person at perceiving it. But then the way you train that is with your mouth, right? So the ear and the mouth there's a direct connection.
Right. Yeah, it's super fascinating. One of the things that I also saw was, or I see this actually coming up once in a while, is there are some people who advocate a listening period when you start learning a new language, where you just basically get as much input as possible on the sounds. And I guess my question in regards to that is, what is the role of listening when you're improving your pronunciation? Do you need to immediately start replicating or mimicking, or do you think that listening and really sitting, doing some active listening, trying to make out the sounds before you start actually trying to reproduce them will be beneficial?
Yeah, I mean, I think I never tried that. I've heard of it, and I can see the logic of it being that when you start off, you don't hear the sounds properly, and which therefore when you try to pronounce them, there's an aspect of you kind of getting in your own way. But at the same time, I personally don't really advocate it or do it myself because I know you can eventually autocorrect. And most importantly, I don't like to encourage any kind of behavior that's like waiting, because people wait for stuff too much when it comes to these kind of things. And yeah, I mean, like if you just dive into it, definitely you need to hear, like you definitely need to hear more than you speak especially at the very beginning, because that you have to hear first before you know how to actually pronounce it. But so when you first start off, if you start pronouncing right at the beginning, which is what I always encourage people to speak from day one and just get in there and start talking. Don't care about, at the same time I say care about pronunciation, don't care about it while you're actually talking. Like it's something you practice on when you go home, but in the field, just have fun and focus on communication and conversation. So yeah, if you do that though, and you keep your ear open and you do enough training, things start to autocorrect. The whole idea of the mimic method is that you listen to how the other person says it, and then you open your ear up to it, and you can see the difference between how you would have said it and how he said it, and then gradually adjust it until you sound like that.
Right. And is that an active process that you have to do to replace? Because I've seen a lot of people, or at least heard a lot of people who have lived in just an example from Denmark, for instance, but I know it exists everywhere, where people, they come to a country and they live there for ages, they hear the language for 30 years, and they still have that accent they came with, pretty much. Does that mean that as a language learner, we should have an active attitude towards changing our pronunciation, or is there something else going on there?
Sure. I mean, so that's kind of the logic behind that waiting period thing, which is the first time you pronounce something, you're going to pronounce it wrong, but there's also a risk of building a habit. So everything we do is habit. All my speech right now is habit. And when you're learning a new language, you're trying to learn new habits. Yeah. So if you go to a place for 30 years, you can open up your ear and really try to fine tune it, or you can reinforce habits you've already had. And that's what happens to people who've been in a place for a long time, and they basically have not been able to hear the details, and they enforce the habit. And then if they want to improve it, the first step is listening really, really close in detail and active practice with accent training. And then they're like, oh, now I hear the difference between how I say it and how they say it. But now, unlike the person who just started the language, they have 30 years of habit that they have to undo. And that's not easy. It's possible, but it's not easy at all. And I have older students, and we hear them. We put them in the drill training, and then they'll get it. They get it, and okay, now I get it, and they pronounce it right. But then like 2 lessons later, they fall back on that same habit. So it's really difficult. Like people don't realize how much habit is involved in speaking. I said the word "we're just" a billion times in my life, and I said it the exact same way because it's a habit,
Right. And that I guess that comes as a warning to new language learners is, do it right from the start. Don't ignore it like the bad students in the language class. Don't take it. Don't sit around and wait for pronunciation skills to magically appear.
Yeah. I mean, like I said, there's different varying degrees. I've seen almost over 1,000 people at this point hearing their accents, and there's definitely some people just have a more open ear at the outset, and they can self-correct easier. And there's some people who don't get it as quickly, but they will with enough training. And those people particularly need to be careful with building up habits, because man, there's nothing more frustrating than trying to undo a habit. So if you got a fresh palate and you're coming to a new language, it doesn't take that much. Just take a few weeks to just really listen to the sounds before you jump into everything else. I mean, once again, you can go out there and speak and stuff, but like, I don't know, I personally don't advocate a lot of like hardcore, all that kind of memorization of things. I actually don't advocate premature literacy. Literacy is one of the number one things that gets in the way of people's pronunciation, because now you bring in a new habit, and that's a habit of seeing shapes and associating your native language sounds to it, and then having to do new sounds. That's a huge issue that, half the pronunciation mistakes I hear are just because people are seeing the word in their head and nothing else.
Right.
So that's another thing. So, but yeah, if you just really get into the sounds and be patient with letting your ear adjust, then you'll save yourself a lot of frustration down the line.
Right. Yeah, and you totally see that from people, probably not unlike yourself, where they really focus on the pronunciation early, and then they sound almost native, and they do get mistaken for native speakers, which must be one of the biggest compliments you can get as a language learner.
Yeah, it's a great feeling. It's definitely something to strive for. Like, and even if you're not mistaken, people react to you differently when you sound like them. Like, and they study this as well. Like, the same way we relate, people look at somebody that look like them, like, oh yeah, you're kind of like me. It's a similar thing. I can show up to China. I don't like Chinese people at all, but at the time I spoke really good Chinese, and like my accent was good enough to fool people on the phone, at least not in person. But and like people you can see it. They react to you differently than they react to the next foreigner who's kind of separated by that sound divide. And they can even though you look different, completely different culture, they're like, oh, you get me. I can tell because you're saying my jokes and you're saying them with the same twang that I have,
Yeah. Yeah, I think it does mean a lot because you connect on a much deeper level. It's not just speaking the language; it's also speaking the subtleties and the emotion, I guess, in a way.
It's an emotion.
You understand the deeper level. And I hope that more people would take it more seriously because, like I said, when I started about 2 years ago, I just didn't prioritize pronunciation at all, and that made it really hard for Russian because it's a very
Yeah, for
pronounce.
sure.
It's very important for in pronunciation. And my tutor tried, bless her, but it's hard to unlearn those habits. And now when I starting to learn Hungarian, the first thing I did was go to that first chapter in the books. That's always like the sounds of the language, and I just
Sure.
listened to them a few times. And it's not perfect. I still have to. I've work to do, but at least I've come a long way from not giving a damn about pronunciation and coming back to
Yeah,
it here.
well, I'm always shocked. We're making a bunch of kind of free kind of courses right now called the Core Sound Series, and it's basically just a resource where you can see these are the every single possible sound you would make in Hungarian, and then we go over each one and how it's made with the mouth, and then the idea is that even if you don't get it right away, it's really useful to know which ones do you already know and which ones do you don't. I'm always shocked at how much people they don't actually know what the sounds are. Like they've been studying for 10 years, they don't know what the actual sounds are because no one talks about phonetics, no one talks about it. And it's like these are the building blocks. The example I think of is like a keyboard, there's about 43 sounds in English, right? Depending on what accent. And like there's a keyboard with 43 keys, and you go there and like you've been missing 5 keys in your keyboard for like 5 years, and like, man, just stop, take it to the store, find out what those 5 keys are, put them in, and then start typing. So that's what even if you don't get it right away, just knowing what sounds are going to trip you up and where they appear makes you a lot more focused, and the actual pronunciation problem gets reduced down to like 10% of the size you thought it was.
Right. And people can obviously find that or those on mimicmethod.com, right?
Yeah, mimicmethod.com is our site.
Cool. And a little quick fire round maybe of before we have just a few minutes left here.
Sure.
I was thinking, what kind of materials do you like to sort of supplement something like Mimic Method for pronunciation? What kind of language learning materials do you like in general? Just in short answers.
Sure. So in general, as I mentioned before, I'm strongly advocate against what I call premature literacy training. It's better to become like a basic conversational level and command of the sounds before you start introducing this new medium of text. And but most language programs out there are text based, and that's a big issue why people get messed up so much. So any language program that's pure audio based, I always recommend. I recently been learning German, and I started off doing Pimsleur, which is just audio. And what I did, which I also recommend to people, is if you're sitting down, you're doing Pimsleur, it might not be as interesting. The context are not like the most enrapturing.
Right.
But if you're what I was doing was I would just take walks, and I've also read that like walking and stuff like that actually activates certain things in your brain for you to memorize things better, which I definitely felt that. But it just makes it more interesting. And like I would just put in the headphones, take walks. I like taking walks anyways. And then you're just listening to people talking and you're repeating afterwards. Because I think people use script as a crutch. A lot of people are really uncomfortable with Pimsleur at the beginning because they're like, I can't really hear what they're saying. But if it literally just takes a few days to get over the hump, and you'll thank yourself later. And then I haven't really tried Michelle Thomas, but he's also a similar audio-based thing. So any kind of thing where you do with headphones and you don't do any kind of visual stimuli except the ocean or the forest or the people on the street as you walk. That's what I like to do.
Well, it's funny you say that because apart from Michel Thomas and Pimsleur, I'm actually not aware of any other kind of, let's say, comprehensive courses out there that only have audio, or at least have an audio that you can follow without the text. Because something like Teach Yourself or Colloquial, yeah, you can listen to the audio alone, but it's like they don't actually give the translations. They just give you the dialogue and which is, I mean, that's kind of helpful. You have to
Sure.
be really, I guess you have to be a detective almost to work out what the words mean. But of course, in terms of pronunciation, it's a good practice. But I mean, try going through a colloquial or teach yourself listening only to the foreign dialogue of a language you're just starting to learn.
Yeah, exactly. That's too much.
I mean, that's
Yeah,
not
those
going
are
to
two
happen.
I don't do it either. And in the future, I like to make my own courses of that, but it's such a huge endeavor. But yeah, it's a shame. There should be more like it. It's just my theory is that when you're in the business of language learning, you have to balance between what people need and like what people are gonna want and use and pay money for.
Right.
And if you give people cool images and like letters they can latch onto, then they're gonna be like, oh yes. But people will give up too easy on the other ones. But
right.
just like anything else, it's hard. If you don't challenge yourself, you won't learn it. So don't use crutches.
That's funny, and I hadn't another aha moment because I was just thinking if I was using my colloquial and I was listening to the audio, that's good, but I would be looking in the book for the word, which mean that I would link the sound to the word, and then when I need to recall it, I would not think about the sound first. I would think about the word first. And
Yeah,
that would
we're
probably
very
make a terrible pronunciation. Or okay.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely influences it. And like I said, the way I explain it is, if you see the letter T, right? There's nothing intrinsic about the letter T. It's just like a horizontal line and a vertical line, right? And doesn't mean anything. But since I was like 4 years old, I've been looking at that symbol and thinking of placing the tip of my tongue against the gum line, saying, right. And like that. And then since I was 5, I'm turning 28 soon. 23 years, I think, So I probably said at least 1 billion times. And then all of a sudden you learn Portuguese, and then when you have that next to an I, it's not anymore, it's a ch, right? So, oh, okay, switch tracks after 1 billion times, let's do a new one. And lo and behold, when you see someone trying to say a word in Portuguese, an American or something like that, they're going to say that instead of the ch when they're reading it half the time, because even if they already know. So, but if I had heard that sound, I learned Portuguese illiterate, and then I learned how to read afterwards. In my head, if I had to spell that word, I would have spelled it as CH, because that's how we spell that sound in English. And then when I see it on paper, I'm like, oh, that's how you spell that. That's a much better experience than knowing how you spell it first and then struggling with the pronunciation. I'm always delighted when I find out that like a word is actually 2 words and I thought it was just one. And like, I'm glad to have like with illiterate people problems when I'm learning a language, because that means that like I'm really feeling the way it sounds.
Right.
And but yeah, unfortunately, there's not that many good resources out there that give a person the opportunity to learn that way.
No, I'll just plug one that I've been using lately, and what they do is they offer an audio only sort of method, but it's not a very comprehensive taking you from nothing to something. It's just a kind of, I'd call it a supplement. And that's the innovative languages, the Pod 101s and the language class, because they have tons of audio lessons that you can listen to in standalone. You don't need the script and you don't need any flashcards or anything. So if people are interested in an audio-based method, I would call it a supplement, because I don't think you actually, you learn a little bit of grammar, you learn a little bit of vocabulary, and you definitely learn how to pronounce things, but it's not a very comprehensive explaining all the details and really starting it out. I like the method, and they have a crazy offer going, which I wrote about on the blog, where you can download their entire library for every language, and it's just $1 per language. So you can get like 3,000 audio files for $1.
Are they going out of business?
I don't know what to do, but it's like it's like a 30-day trial, right? And then unlimited premium access for $1 for 30 days. And if you cancel the membership, it's $1. It's like I guess they hope that people like it so much that they're like supporting it or something. I don't know, but I wrote a guide to that, and it's not because it's very complicated, but downloading all the files is quite complicated. So I made a little guide on the website actualfluency.com.
Cool. Nice.
/ Pod 101 offer. So you can read that, and it will show you. It's a little bit cumbersome because there's no way to just grab all. You have to actually manually click each one. But 10 minutes of work for probably a year's worth of audio or something.
And like I said, you download that on your iPod and just take nice walks and just load it up. That's my way. I see all these things as like a kind of jump frog to the point where you can have a basic conversation, and then from there, that's where you really learn.
Right.
And but yeah, if you can just walk for an hour and do an hour of those lessons every day, and it's really super helpful.
Yeah, repeat out loud as much as possible. Even if
Repeating out loud. Like don't be quiet. Do it out loud. Don't be afraid of people judging you in the street. It's just part of life. You gotta get over it.
If it's a foreign language anyway, they might be thinking, "Oh, he's just on the phone or something."
Exactly.
Oh, cool. Well, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show and talk about the passion of yours, which is pronunciation. And I mean, I'm really happy to have learned a lot, and I had a few aha moments during the call. So I hope that the listeners also feel this way. And best of luck with Mimic Method. And I hope to see more of you in the future.
All right. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you for listening to the Actual Fluency Podcast.